Hello and welcome to the first quarterly meeting of 2026 for the Kansas chapter of the International Western Music Association. We are kicking off with Lunch and Learn featuring Annie Wilson, one of our longtime members. Annie is a musician, a songwriter, and a rancher, and today we're going to hear about the story of the Five Oaks Ranch. Annie.
Thank you, Martha. This is the first half of a talk I prepared on the 100th birthday of our ranch. I gave it last June as a prairie talk at the Pioneer Bluffs Center for Ranching Heritage at Matfield Green. Jeff Davidson, our member, is the president there. But it's an hour long, so I'm just doing the first half this time. And I'll just begin just by saying this photograph is taken of the upland pasture on our ranch. It is mainly by an accident of birth that I have been fortunate to live on this ranch. So to begin, this is the story of Five Oaks Ranch, and though it is just one ranch and probably not an entirely typical one, its story illustrates many aspects of the Flint Hills. The term landcestors, I thought I invented this. It came in my head, but it turns out I looked up and other people had thought of it too. But this came to me one day as I was doing all this research on this project to describe the kinship that I feel with all these people that I have learned about and will share with you about, most of whom are not my blood relatives. They also have lived on the ranch's land, surrounded by the same creeks, horizons, and meadows as those we love today. And I just thought about how it isn't always blood that connects us through our shared experience on this land. I feel like these people are family and part of this place. So to begin, and I am not advancing here. Okay, there we go. Five Oaks Ranch, where is it? Well, we live in northwest Chase County, and this is a map of the Flint Hills in Kansas, kind of north to south in Kansas. We're west of Elmvale, west of Cottonwood Falls. We live along Middle Creek, between Diamond Creek and Cottonwood and the Cottonwood River. The ranch is basically has two different landscapes divided by the road, Middle Creek Road. North of the road is the majority of the property, and it's upland pasture in the upper picture there. And to the south is lowland crop and timber areas. This talk divides the ranch's history into 5 eras shown across the top here. The Native people, early settlers, and the Wiley draft horse period are what I'm going to talk about today in the first half hour. The next, actually 100 years when my family owned it, is the Browning Ranch for 68 years, and then John and I, the Wilson family, for the last 32. So just doing the first half today. Of course, beginning with the Native people, and I could spend many hours on this section. Indigenous people, of course, comprise the majority of people who have ever lived here, by far, so very far, the longest. But because of lack of written records, also in some ways the most mysterious. We have found numerous artifacts on the ranch similar to these. An archaeologist told us that many are from the Archaic era, going back up to 6,000 years. In the historic period, primarily 2 nations, the Kansa and Osage, ranged over the area that is now our ranch. And they moved around, of course. These 2 people are actually related. Centuries ago, they originated in lands to the east. Both were relegated to ever smaller reservations in Kansas and finally forced to leave their homes and move to Oklahoma in the late 1870s. And although government policies have tried to eradicate these people and their culture, many today, including myself, are looking to Indigenous leaders for guidance in their values of how to live in kinship with the land as we go into the future. And I'm involved actually in some education curriculum development with a group of Native people in Lawrence. I'm learning so much from them. Okay, the earliest white settlers I've divided into 4 topics: the homesteaders, and then the large interim landholders, railroads, and land syndicates, then 2 long-standing immigrant families on the place, and a little bit about the local communities. Okay, to begin with the homesteaders. After the Native Americans were forced out, the U.S. government wanted to get people to settle and own the land. They offered it to settlers in 2 different ways. First, from serving in the military, like the old GI Bill, but you get land, and the other by homesteading, building a home and farming on it for 5 years. William Campbell was the earliest settler who got his land the first way from serving as a soldier. He got a patent or first deed in 1861, signed by Abraham Lincoln, for 40 acres across from where John and I live now. We've never found the home site. It was probably farmed over long ago. But we wondered, well, what war? 1861 is a little early for the Civil War, so we thought, okay, war with Mexico, 1848. But then we saw on his patent, no, he fought in the War of 1812. He was born in 1874, fought in the War of 1812 when he was 28. 47 years later, he came to Chase County at age 75, a widower, leaving 6 grown children back in Virginia, and filed his soldier's claim. He lived here and farmed 8 years on Middle Creek and died at age 85. I have all the documentation on this, so pretty incredible. Not sure I'd be up to that when I'm 75. Through discovering the remaining foundations on the land and a lot of research, we've learned there have actually been 12 home sites on the ranch. The red locations on the map at left include Mr. Campbell's. The first 8 were early homesteaders in the 1800s. The last 3 are homes in the 1900s and 2000s, all built on previous homestead sites. And there's one foundation that we just have no records telling who it was. When we see these old home foundations, we have so many questions. Who lived there and what did they do? We did find their names and birth dates, a little bit about most of them, and discovered some common themes. They were all part of a large Western migration. A few came here directly from eastern states, New York, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut. But most were from families that hopscotched across the states in between, coming from Ohio, Illinois, Kentucky, and Indiana. Often they didn't stay long. Almost all left. Why? Some we found out for health and financial reasons, early droughts. We can only guess on the others. Maybe they were restless, had further ambition. Places they went to from our ranch were other parts of Kansas, on to Oklahoma, New Mexico, and California. A quick comment on the last settled parcels claimed in the 1880s and 90s after the better lowlands were claimed. These were way up on the northern upland areas of our ranch, far from reliable surface water and thin rocky soil. These areas are great for pasture, but they make poor farm fields, and much soil was lost from plowing them. The fields had been long abandoned, and native grass is slowly reclaiming its place. We call these areas go back. But this picture shows where about 2 feet of topsoil was lost, which will take centuries to rebuild. Really tragic. This was taken just after a burn in the spring, so you can see it. In addition to the early settlers with small landholdings, there were 3 groups of large landholders who also played a big part in the early history of the ranch and all of the Flint Hills: railroads, land syndicates, and speculators. To help settle the West, the U.S. gave huge tracts of land for free to the railroads, all the odd-numbered sections 10 miles wide on each side of the routes, 3 million acres. The idea was for the railroads to sell land to the settlers, to pay for construction of new rail lines, and to attract settlers, customers, to live along the railroad lines and use them. On our ranch, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad sold 3 parcels to settler families in 1873. But overall, direct sale like this proved too burdensome for the railroads. Settlers didn't have money. They needed loans. Most only wanted to buy smaller tracts. So, to relieve the railroads of this burden and capitalize on easy profit, a number of landholding and lending syndicates stepped in. Importantly, these syndicates set patterns for land ownership we still see in the Flint Hills today, especially in our area. In Chase County in 1882, railroads sold holdings to 2 large syndicates. The first was the Eastern Land and Loan Company. It mainly subdivided and resold to settlers, usually with a loan involved. This way, it had a dual opportunity for profit, from increasing the land price on resale and from earning interest on the mortgage to the settler. So how did this affect our ranch? In 1884, Eastern bought a large upland parcel from the railroad for $3 an acre. The same year, they resold it to the settler Praw family for $5.11 an acre, taking a profit of $2.11 an acre, or 70%. The Praws took out mortgages on this and other ranch properties, so they also made money from the mortgage. The second large landholding syndicate was the Western Land and Cattle Company, a Scotch-British owned firm. This group actually avoided resale to small owners entirely and instead went into the cattle business themselves. They bought 95,000 acres in 2 years, building 94 miles of barbed wire fence. They helped develop the transient grazing model that became dominant in the Flint Hills, where steers, often from Texas, are brought in only for the grazing season and then shipped out. The 1901 plat book on the left, mainly the north of our place, shows a number of full sections that were originally Western land and cattle, and eventually became part of the famous 101 Ranch, which owned 17 sections and also had huge holdings in Oklahoma. Even today, many of these sections are still held by large absentee landowners, currently the Tallgrass Holding Company. So that's the pattern of ownership that has persisted. In comparison, the map on the right of the neighborhood to the south, including our place, shows smaller sized parcels with more numerous different owners. So these early economic forces established patterns of land ownership in the Flint Hills that continue today. Overall, the grants to the railroads resulted in tremendous wealth for railroad owners and land syndicates. But it also provided a way for ranchers to get their cattle to central markets, such as the Kansas City stockyards. In Chase County, our ranch utilized a little spur line that the ATSF built from Neva Crossing onto the northwest along Diamond Creek to a place called Heimer. A third group of large interim landowners in the area and on our ranch were independent land speculators who bought and sold land only for a profit, never intending to live on it or use it. On our ranch, one such speculator I found was George Williams, who lived in New York. In the 1900 census, he actually listed his occupation as capitalist and showed 2 live-in servants as household occupants. In 1895, he bought most of our ranch at a sheriff's sale, of course, through a local attorney, held the land for a few years, and then resold. This was indeed the Gilded Age, and the super rich railroads, land syndicates, and speculators were profiting even out in these remote hills. Okay, on to the immigrant families. Whereas the American-born homesteaders did not last long on the ranch, interestingly, the 2 longest-term early settlers were foreign-born immigrant families, the Praws from Germany and Maybells from France, a testament to that classic immigrant work ethic and perseverance. The earliest were the Praws. Fred Praw was born in Zimmer, Germany in 1839. When he was 11, his family emigrated to New York, then Wisconsin, and at age 19 in 1858, he and a brother walked to Chase County, Kansas. Meanwhile, in 1860, Miranda, also at age 11, came with her family, the Pratts, from Ohio in a covered wagon. They homesteaded in 1860 on Middle Creek, our creek. Fred found work on the Pratt's farm, fell in love with the farmer's daughter. Eventually, he and Miranda were married. They began homesteading and acquiring their own land. They eventually put together the majority of our ranch as it is today, acquiring 9 adjacent parcels of bottomland and upland. They had to utilize 5 different methods of acquisition, each a complex transaction. One parcel they filed a homestead on. The other parcels they purchased, 2 from the railroad, 2 from Eastern Land and Loan, like we talked about, 1 from the Kansas state, and 3 from the earlier homesteaders who were leaving. This was a huge accomplishment. We think of them as our real founders. They had 9 children. Each one has amazing stories. Miranda and Fred eventually moved to the west, where they lived the rest of their lives. The Praws leave an especially impressive legacy. There's an annual family reunion of descendants of those 2 people that is still meeting to this very day. Here is their Facebook group dedicated to preserving history and family ties. Fred and Miranda are in their Facebook group profile at left. Would they ever have dreamed of such a thing? The group also includes the descendants of Miranda's family, the Pratts. One more aspect of the Pra legacy is stone construction, including their double stone arch barn that was built in two stages. The first with impressive hand beams. My dogs, Katie and Travis, a lot of work store and observed also in the ranch. Finally, I want to share one story from a son-in-law to the Pras named William Stotts. Jim Hoy wrote that prior to the 1880s and the arrival of war, there were herder remote, unfenced pastures and lived with the cattle, basically like a shepherd. Both his mother and stepmother had died. William's father sent him out to shepherd 300 head of cattle in a large upland pasture. He lived that whole summer by himself in a dugout at age 14. On our ranch, we also have a dugout way up in our upland pasture, quite possibly also lived in by a herder boy. We only recently learned about the other immigrant family on our ranch, the Maybells. We'd always wondered who lived in this two-room stone home that is still partially standing in our northern pasture. It was a mystery, mainly because we didn't get the abstract on that part of land. Then, a few years ago, I found an article in the Chase County Historical Sketches and did some more research and found that the home belonged to the French immigrant Maybell family. And then I found this photo of lovely Marianne and her husband Nicholas, 21 years older than she, who came from Alsace-Lorraine, France, to the United States in 1855. They eventually homesteaded here on the ranch in 1867 and held the land for 33 years. They homesteaded two parcels and raised three children in this little stone home. In 1882, at age 73, Nicholas died of typhoid. Marianne was only 52. She stayed on in her older years, lived part of the time with her children, and also with the neighboring Pra family who kindly took her in. As part of the local tradition of place names from early settlers, the tributary on the ranch, which comes from the north down into Middle Creek, was named Maybell Creek. My husband welded this sign to mark our trail across the creek. And another interesting local historical connection to one of the children of the Maybell family is that their daughter Mary married Selden or Saul Heskett. They made their home north of the ranch upon Diamond Creek. Selden was also 16 years older than Mary, and earlier in life he was a trader on the Santa Fe Trail, running the Rock Creek Trading Post near Agnes City. Finally, on the Maybells, we want to share a letter written in 1904 by Marianne, probably her last. Her maiden name in France, her last name, had been Joseph. Long widowed, now at age 74, she must have heard of some people somewhere named Joseph. So she wrote them this note, which the Pra family saved. We don't know if it was recopied and actually mailed, or possibly never sent because she died that year. Mainly, it shows how much she and probably other immigrants must have deeply missed all of their relatives and family left so far behind. She wrote, I came west the year before the war. I left my people in state New York. I can't hear from them. You're the only Joseph I ever heard of. Maybe we are related. What is your father and mother's name? I would like to find my people. I am 74 years old. If you think we are a relation, I will come and see you. I am now with Miss M.F. Pra on Middle Creek, near Elk, if you want to see me. We were so touched by this message. Now a little about our local communities near the ranch. There were three, Elk, Heimer, and Elmdale. Our ranch is the green dot in the northwest part of the county in between three communities. The closest, just 3 miles to our west, was the community of Elk, likely because of the native elk that were found there in the early days and later hunted out. It's along Middle Creek Road. As you can see from this early map, at one time it was a significant settlement because its name was printed in the same size font as Cottonwood Falls. Elk had a grocery and dry goods store, a blacksmith shop, creamery, church, but critically, no railroad. In 1931, it all burned, and there's nothing left at Elk today except the neighboring Elk Cemetery near our place. To the north was the community of Heimer, located on Diamond Creek, where we shipped our cattle on the spur line built by the ATSF Railroad in 1887. It had a full set of stockyards, a church, a school, a store, and a depot, which closed in 1951. It's all gone now. And then to our east was Elmdale, 8 miles away, which we all know remains today with a tiny remnant of homes along Highway 50. But in its time, it was the commercial hub of Middle Creek and the surrounding area. Of course, with the automobile and centralization of commerce, these little communities have all faded away. Elmville had the further disadvantage of being on the floodplain and was devastated in 1951 and successive flood events. Our most colorful eras began in 1902 when L.R. Wiley and Sons purchased the ranch. We'll tell about the draft horse business, historic barn, and finally the Middle Creek Fair. First, the draft horse breeding business. In 1902, the New York speculator George Williams, that we heard about, sold the ranch lands to L.R. and Emma Wiley. They were both from well-established families in Colfax, Illinois, and moved here with two teenage sons, Lon and Roy. For the next 20 years, they strongly promoted the philosophy that better bred horses would lead to more efficient work and greater farm profits for farmers across the area. Mr. Wiley was a risk taker. He borrowed heavily and advertised heavily. The Wileys promoted high-bred English and European draft horse bloodlines in the Percheron Shire and Belgian breeds. Think pre-automobile. These were the tractors and trucks of the time. Horsepower was literally horsepower, and these breeds were the Cadillacs. L.R. and his son Roy traveled to New York and even overseas to France and Belgium to acquire the finest bloodlines. Of course, at this time, travel to Europe meant a long ride on an ocean liner. These were the days of the Titanic, returning with the large horses on board brought back across the Atlantic Ocean. The Wileys even imported trainers from England. By the looks of this fellow's cap, he might have been one. The horses were brought by train to Elmdale and then led by hand up the road 8 miles to the ranch. Here are just a few of the many Wiley advertisements. The upper left announcing a trip to Europe where they will, quote, not spare any expense, but look for the best to be had. To the right, the announcement of an expansion into Emporia, where they bought the pile horse and mule market of 10 acres on 6th Avenue, including stockyards, barns, and a residence. Pretty sure where the Emporia Livestock Auction is today. This beautiful illustration came from the 33-page catalog for their big sale held in 1911 and depicts the ranch's headquarters, a house on the left, office and barn in the back, and on the right, the Praws stone arch barn, and in front, another long open shed also of stone and numerous stone walls. The trainers are leading the enormous, powerful horses up the lane. On the right is a full-page ad the Wileys put in the Kansas Farmer magazine to promote this sale. You might have noticed the unusual round-topped barn in the illustration. This barn was built in 1909 when the Wileys hired a neighboring farmer and builder to construct a sizable horse barn with room enough for 25 of their big draft horses. The barn had a unique design with the large false front facade popular at the time in town buildings, but unusual on a farm. Originally painted across the front were the Wiley name and various horse breeds, even 2 oval paintings featuring their horses. Artist Martha Knudsen created this sketch of the barn, which she included in her 1993 Kansas Barns book and calendar. Unfortunately, the enormous barn fell into disrepair when it no longer had any use. Draft horses were obsolete after the 1940s. Efforts were undertaken to preserve it over the decades, but it was terribly large, expensive to keep up, and especially due to its interior design, had no real function on the ranch. Efforts were made to obtain historical grants to preserve it, but experts pronounced it beyond repair. For safety reasons, sadly, John and I had it taken down in 1994. It was the end of an era after it had stood for 84 years as a local landmark. And then final section here, and I'll finish up, was the Middle Creek Fair. The Wileys were not satisfied just running a big fancy draft horse ranch. They started the Middle Creek Fair, probably the most spectacular aspect of the Wiley period. This was a remarkable event from 1915 until around 1920. It was organized by the Middle Creek Fair Association, a group of local farmers and ranchers, and held on the quote fairgrounds of the Wiley Ranch up on a wide flat plateau behind the headquarters. Tickets for 35 cents each were sold from the window in the big barn as people came in. There were so many amazing things about this fair, but the main one was the attendance. They averaged 1,200 people a day. And on one day, they estimated 3,000. So when I stand up there in the pasture with the cattle, that is flat out hard for me to imagine. The 1916 Middle Creek Fair book list of officers included L.R. Wiley, also Fritz Praw, a son of Fred and Miranda, and John Badger, a renowned local cowboy who Jim Hoy has written about. The schedule of events for the 2 days was packed full with the parade, foot races, horse races, rodeo, baby shows, speeches, Friday night a big dance under the tent, and Saturday late afternoon a baseball game of Elmdale versus Lincolnville. Meanwhile, there were 84 categories of judged contests with livestock ranging from horses, mules, cattle, chickens, and fancy work or sewing, jelly, pickles, pies, and garden produce. The old photos show the homemade announcer's stand up on the pole. Notice the large triangle up on the right. That is a megaphone, so that was their PA system. Also, Cowboy Johnny Badger is shown serving as a judge, probably of the rodeo events. Then you can see in the distance the line of cars around the perimeter. News articles reported that motoring parties from Chase, Morris, and Butler counties, as well as Oklahoma, Wichita, Emporia, Topeka, and Kansas City came. It was a big deal. One of the more spectacular attractions was in the 1917 fair when early aviator Baxter Adams brought his airplane. It came to pieces by rail to Elmdale, then was brought out on hay racks, pulled by horses, and assembled on the grounds. He performed daring tricks and gave rides to brave souls for $5. Each year, the fair also held a baby show, with the newspaper claiming there was, quote, no shortage of fine Kansas babies on exhibit. And the 1916 fair book even announced that Teddy Roosevelt would be at the fair. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt was actually a draft horse stallion advertised for stud service. In 1918, there was a mishap that could have been serious, the type of nightmare the symphony in the Flint Hills would have dreaded. During the Harrington Ladies Band morning rehearsal up on the fair site, a big wind blew the tent over, with them inside it. A newspaper account reported that the ladies landed in a heap with chairs, instruments, and tent on top of them. Thankfully, there were no serious injuries, just a few bruises and 22 sadly disheveled and dusted uniforms. The ladies were good sports, brushed themselves off, and went ahead and played for the dance that night. The Middle Creek Fair even included a rodeo-type Wild West show with bronco riding, fancy riding by ladies, probably trick riding, roping contests, and a major horse race, finally bulldogging. This latter event is especially notable because it brought probably the most famous person ever to be on our ranch, native Texan Bill Pickett, who was a star of the 101 Ranch's Wild West show and has had books written about him. He was the first African-American cowboy to be inducted into the Cowboy Hall of Fame. Pickett is credited with inventing the technique of bulldogging, grabbing cattle by the horns and wrestling them to the ground. Bulldogging later developed into the rodeo sport of steer wrestling. However, Pickett was not permitted to compete in the sport at many rodeos, which were for whites only. We're sure glad he got to come to our place for the Middle Creek Fair. So, whatever happened to the Wileys? Let's see. I might be missing. Yes, okay. There are no descendants in the area. Unfortunately, they lost their ranch on Middle Creek in 1924 to foreclosure. I had always assumed it was the transition to tractors that hurt them, but I've since learned that that transition didn't really happen until about a decade later. People used teams well into the 30s and 40s. An alternative explanation was given by a descendant of the Wileys who stated The entire imported registered horse operation was an ill advised enterprise in this area. He said most farmers around here just could not afford them. So the Wileys owned another ranch near Florence and moved there in 1924. This is shown in this picture. Interestingly, this ranch was eventually bought by the Grimwoods, who happened to be our Jeff Davidson's family, our member of Western Music Association. So this is where Jeff grew up. And then in 1934, the Wileys moved back to Illinois, both in their 70s. And so basically, that's the first half. And if you ever want me to do the second half, it starts with my great grandfather's business, which was actually in the Kansas City stockyards, and that's where they did well enough that they were able to purchase the ranch we're on now in 1925. So that's the 100th anniversary. Okay, I'm done. I think, let's see, how do I get out? I can't quite see the stop share. There we go. Okay,
Annie, that was fantastic.
thank you.
I can't believe the amount of research that you have done. That is just such a gift.
We were really, yeah, really lucky. And we had a guy that never threw anything away. So in the family, so we've got boxes of papers. And then
How,
ancestry.com and the Bureau of Land Management deed records, you can find stuff.
how long did it take you to research that? How many decades have you been coming up with all this stuff?
Well, the last about a year before this, my daughter helped me, and also my dad was a real history buff, and it's been a thing that's interested my family for a long time.
Well, that's marvelous. Thank you so much for sharing. Does
You
anybody have
bet.
a question of Annie before we start our formal meeting? All
Enjoyable.
right.
Thank you.
Thank
Very good,
you.
Annie.
Thanks.
Really marvelous. Thank
I
you,
thought I
Annie.
saw Jeff on the hill there, but I don't know. It's one of those depictions.
You thought
Oh,
what,
Mm.
Mark?
yeah.
I thought I saw Jeff out there. He was waving his hand.
I have a question. Did
He's
you?
got a beautiful place. Jeff, that ranch is gorgeous over there in
Well,
Florence.
I wish it was. I wish it was in good repair. Let's put it that way. But yeah, we had a real nice barn that the Wileys made. No, they came in 24. It's built before that, but it burned down in 58. But yeah, but it was a draft horse barn for sure.
Hmm.
Yeah, whoa.
You said your grandfather bought it and
Great grandfather.
great grandfather in the 20s.
In 25, yep.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so it's been in your family since then.
100 years last year was our anniversary. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Marvelous. Absolutely marvelous. Thank you, Annie Wilson.
Sure.